with the national adaptation plans and the national standards. If there's different national adaptation plans, what will be the result of international standards? That's what we would like to discuss with you. I think in the ISO pavilion, we are not really trying to do a lot of presentations and telling you about the solutions. It's inviting you to share your thoughts with us as an input for our technical committees. That's why I'm so happy to have Martin here representing TC207. So that's one of the technical committees that is on the receiving end for these recommendations and how they should deal with these challenges that we are trying to overcome all together. So I think just to set the scene for what we have planned for this session together with you. I mean, we had a lot of roundtable discussion. You see, we're sitting in a circle. There's actually no separation between presenters and an audience. We are all panelists, so to speak. We just had this morning even a workshop setting where we engage people in a workshop type discussion. We really want to pick your brains. So I really try to keep myself short, to not talk too much, that we have time to listen to you, to have time for a discussion. But to really kick off the discussion, to have a good understanding. What are we talking about? What is the challenge? We will have a short keynote from Martin, and then I will ask some question to set the scene, and then we'll have some discussion points where we can really exchange ideas, and then hopefully capture these ideas and use them within our technical committees. Clear for everybody? Very good. Thanks for coming. And Martin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I get my teeth going properly. And just to let people know, we have a number of people who are going to be contributing. So thank you in advance for your for what you're going to bring to this session. I think from an ISO perspective, it's interesting. Back in 2006 was the first publication of ISO's standard on climate change, which was all about monitoring, reporting, verification. So this was all about kind of your impact on climate. And it was only in 2019 when the first standard was published in terms of climate adaptation. So we have a standard on climate adaptation which was kind of first conceived in 2015. Just to give you a little bit of an insight, when the UK government developed its national adaptation plan, there was a commitment on IEMA to support the development of standards relating to climate adaptation. So one of the things that we did was we engaged with some of our experts that became the convener of 14,090. Also, because I was involved in 14,001, we introduced the requirement in 14,001 to consider external environmental change in your environmental management system. And I can tell you that the first time that happened, and I raised this as a member of the committee, nobody else supported it. And it was only when we went to the US for a meeting of our working group, and at the time, one of the soft drinks manufacturers had 75% of its sugar supply under threat because of drought. A New York subway had recently been 3 feet underwater. And it was at that moment that we were able to get the change into 14,001. So ISO has been developing climate adaptation standards, but crucially, ISO has also, through the London Declaration, articulated the need to consider climate change across its standards portfolio. So not just in specific climate adaptation standards, but also in relation to quality management, asset management, occupational safety and health, environment, and all of those management system standards. And a change is just being introduced to these standards to require that. Now you might ask the question, how does a quality management system need to think about climate change and the impact of climate change on quality? Well, it's very, very simple. We're in a very hot country here today. And I know where we had record temperatures in the UK. Normally it's cold, it's wet, it's miserable, to be honest. But we've had temperatures of over 40 degrees. One of our zoos had the pavements around melting because the design of that infrastructure was not set to be at 40 degrees. So they couldn't have members of the public in, and therefore they'd had a big reduction in their income. So you can see how that happens. From a safety and health perspective, workers exposed to 40-degree temperatures, that's in the shade, but many, many people don't work in the shade. So suddenly you could be exposed to 60 degrees plus, and therefore we need our occupational safety and health people to think about the impact of climate on our workers. So you can see that the integration of this thinking into our standards is very important, and it has a potentially really big contribution to make to national adaptation and resilience. The other thing I would like to say is that we are now starting to see where some of these adaptation standards are being used by policymakers and regulators to reduce climate-related risks and enhance resilience. So one example is in the UK, where our regulator now says that if you have a site that is under a pollution permit, it has to do a climate change risk assessment, and you are told to use 14,090 as the basis for doing that. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development likewise refers to ISO 14090 as a standard to enhance the resilience and to adapt projects that it's going to fund in different parts of the world, because it knows that this is really important. So I think we're starting to see some of the standards that we've developed in ISO TC207 and more broadly have the potential to have a real contribution to enhancing climate resilience and taking adaptive action in our countries, in our communities, and through our businesses. So I'm going to pause now, and then that sets the scene, hopefully, for the discussion that we're going to have. But I'm happy to take questions if people have got them.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Are there any immediate questions to Martin? Seems to be clear. Perfect setting the scene. Perfect setting the scene. Now we have prepared some questions. Oh, maybe we can show the questions. And the first one is very simple. How well prepared are we? How well prepared are we in your organization, your national standards body, in your organization, to deal with the already changing climate? On a scale from 1 to 5, 1 is extremely good, and 5 is, oh, I'm not prepared at all. Any thoughts? Any immediate thoughts? Where are we today? Are we well prepared? Ricardo.
Thank you. My name is Ricardo Fragoso. I am General Director of ABNT. And very interested in your question. In my vision, I believe it in Brazil, in ABNT, the number 3. Because in this moment, I involved in 276 technical meetings, Brazilian technical meetings. Then it is big challenge for us because it's necessary to engage with the public sector and the stakeholders. Then, in my opinion, 3 for us is good. The 3 actions they mean. One, I have the action plan, and there is the big plan, but the main points, adoption of the international, the series 4,000, the series 4,000 standards, the ISO excellent, the capture of the CO2, it's very, very good for us. Then this is very important, and the standards, the climate changes for the 4 points. The sector for the energy, the sector for solar voltaic, and the wind, the aeolic energy. This is very, very important for us.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. So the national standards body in Brazil is a 3. So it's so la la. All right, I'm not questioning that, but let's discuss how we can improve all together. So SAC in China is also 3. What about the companies in China? What about Alibaba?
We're very diverse. I would say our cloud computing is probably slightly above 3. They just survived a flood earlier this year, I mean, the designing was for 100-year events, but this was a 140-year event. They had no problem. We just had a session in China Pavilion, our retail agriculture. They're developing adaptation, tailored agriculture. So for that, I actually would give it a 2, and considering biodiversity as well. But I would say, logistics, probably below 3. Which, without a comprehensive assessment, but at company level, we're establishing that governance system. But to implement it down, it's a long way to go.
Thank you very much. Any other thoughts? Who is Miriam? You're not talking about Din, are you?
No, I'm talking about Germany. My personal opinion about Germany is also like 2, 3. They are actually having a plan how to adapt to climate change. So on the political level, they are advancing and writing a program, writing a strategy on that, which is very, very good. And standards actually play a role. So this is good. From my personal perspective, I see real and I found that very interesting from your presentation, the question of health when it comes to the workforce, because I personally see that on German construction sites, for example, people working there in a heat of 35 degrees or more. They were not used to that before, but this is changing, so we must also adapt our standards to that, and I think the politics have understood that, and now we have to really work together, the standardization and the regulator to adapt to the new situations. So 3.
Another 3. We don't have to agree. It can be different. What about Jordan?
Jordan is encouraged the adaptation to climate change. We have economic modernization's vision for 2023. One of them, it is encourage the renewable energy, and we will raise the consumer of the energy from the renewable up to 3,000 of the Jordan needs of energy. And the last month, the government launched the green financing and green bonds investment to encourage the investors to be a part, and the banking a part of the green investment. And the government, we encourage the electrical vehicles in Jordan, and solar energy, renewable energy, and in our organizations, we have a technical committee for environment-friendly constructions for building, sustainable development technical committee. In the health and occupationals, recently we have discussions with the Ministry of Labor, and we put the limited for the standards in its regulations, and we have a team for sustainable development in our organization. I think maybe 3, okay.
3 is always a good place in the middle. Any other opinions?
So in Jamaica, we have, I don't think it's as coordinated. We have pockets of things happening. So for example, we have a occupational health and safety standard, which is going to be a regulation. And but implementation is always a concern. Of note, I just remember that we had a death. We had a death because somebody on the construction site got got too hot. He fell and he died. So there are ways to go in terms of implementation. However, in terms of construction, building energy efficiency, we have some very good standards which we are now training our regulators to monitor against. And in terms of energy efficiency, we got some projects working on energy efficiency and solar energy. So there is The 3 is a safe number, right? So there are things happening, but there's more ways to go. Yeah.
Very good. Any other ideas, any other numbers you would like to share with the group? Martin?
Yeah, I think from a UK perspective, and this is, we have an independent body that advises the UK on climate change. And their advice to the UK government is that climate risks are increasing faster than our action to adapt. So I would say the UK is heading from a 3 to a 2 because we're not making sufficient investment and change to become more resilient. So I think this is one of the concepts we have to understand is that the situation is changing fast in terms of climate risk, and therefore we become more vulnerable. And that could be one of the areas that we're particularly concerned about is what we call cascading risks. So you might have, say, the transport system is vulnerable to a failure in the electricity system. And if we have a failure in the electricity system that impacts on our transport system, it has another impact. So this is where, as we start to get a better understanding, and through the use of these standards, then we can start to formulate a better understanding of the risks, and therefore we can start to take that action.
Very good. So,
It's okay? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Christoph. Yeah. If just now Martin said maybe British, England is for the rate is number 2 or 3. If you are number 2, I think China is number 3, because just now Martin said your government, which is responsible for environment protection, ask all the companies, if you want to get a pollution permit, you have to do adaptation risk assessment by the end of the next year. That's very useful. China nowadays we don't have this requirement, so we are 3. And in fact, China also has a national adaptation plan for 2035, and we also developed a lot of standards about renewable energy, about environment protection, about extreme weather broadcast. So we did something. We also set up a number of technical committees. That's all. Thank you.
oh, thanks a lot. There was another contribution.
Thank you. Maybe first I introduce myself. My name is Noah Altine. I'm from ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. We are the European Secretariat. And I would just highlight on the previous questions and some from the discussion points I can see on the screen. But on the rating, I think we'd go into up to 3 because that's something that we work very closely with local governments in terms of the Horizon projects, but also because we do have also the European standards. So we try to emphasize a lot with local governments the understanding of the international standards and how that could set the scene when it comes into meeting targets like the Paris Agreement or the Sendai framework when it comes into climate adaptation and resilience building.
Thank you very much. And I think we did expect a 3 as an answer because everybody is aware about the issue. Everybody has embarked in that journey. We have started with national adaptation plans. We have started to take it into consideration on the standards. What can we do more? And that's why we want to have a discussion. So how can we learn from each other? How can we synchronize the activities that we have in the various countries on the various levels to make sure that we have a consistent approach and we can use as a base international standardization to really help us to move forward in the way of being aware what is changing and how we need to respond to it. So you can see the guiding questions. So really it's about kicking off a discussion. So what can we do? How can we improve? So anybody who wants to share thoughts on any of the questions is more than welcome. Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yuan Bo from the China Petroleum Corporation. This is the largest, one of the largest corporation for the oil and gas in the world. You just, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Christoph, you just said how and what the organizations can do to improve the the standardization of the climate issues. Maybe allow me introduce just a very brief introduction about our CMPC's strategy about the climate change. Actually, as our Mr. Xiu have introduced that after our President Xi Jinping announced our ambitious goals about climate change, 2030 and 2060, many our Chinese companies, especially our large state-owned companies, also made some ambitious plans. I myself responsible for made green development version 3.3 that we have set a series of climate change goals, including traditionally we are the oil and gas companies. Now we have called ourselves a new energy companies. The 1/3 our affairs and our occupations are new energy sectors. So you just cite how, and if we talk about the standardization issues, I'm very honored that Mr. Xiu invited me to take part in this panel. I think actually our experts from the enterprise, we also very want to take part join the standardization process of the climate change, but we have not very chance. So I always ask my friend Sun Liang, let me join, let me join. So we have our experiences, and our companies also encourage us to join the standardization. The internet standardization give us many high prize if we can join climate, not only climate, any other international standardization. So if my suggestions, I hope you can invite as more as the expert from the industries, the companies, the staffs to join the process. And that's my opinion. Thank you.
Martin can help you. Martin invite you.
Well, may I explain because Mr. Yuanbo said we want urgently to join the international standardization work, but as I know, the ISO have different committees. For ISO TC207, we are doing the very general and the standards, not very specific to one sectors. So it's yes, I know it's we got a lot of chance. Don't worry, you are in. But for me, my name is Sun Liang. It's from the CNS, China International China National Standardization Institute, and also the member of ISO TC207. For me, it's I'm the member of TC207 SC7. So this greenhouse gas and climate change subcommittee. Right now, I'm the TD3. The communication and engagement conveners, and to have the broadcasting our standards to all over the world, also inside, both inside and outside. So this SA7 have done a lot of important international standards like 14064 part 1 to 3, and also it's the mitigation side for this topic. It's very important adaptation standards, just like Martin showed all of the panels. The 14090 and the BSI and the CNS SAC have jointly to develop the first ISO standard for the adaptation 14090. Under that is a framework through using the LCA perspective to a perspective to build a framework that what we should do for the adaptation work. So the first is to the next standard is 14091, is the vulnerabilities. The dean colleague, with the convener, the Webeck, this secretary, and Clemens, and know each other. So do the vulnerability assessment first and risk to figure out what's the vulnerability and risk there. After that, the goal is to 14.092. You have to make the adaptation plan based that the vulnerabilities. Then maybe we're talking about with the John Dora. John Dora is the TG2 under SE7 is the adaptation task force. So we figure out what are we doing next. Is maybe the next is the monitoring and the evaluation. Maybe to make the whole picture full. So where are the pieces and to make our adaptation working. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. What I so far understand is that we have developed a good methodology how to approach the topic of climate adaptation, but we need to deploy it in the technical committees that are sector specific, where we have the industry people sitting, that they can kind of apply this methodology to the sector specific requirements, and then of course use it at home and implement it. But I mean, you see as a second question, do we need a joint scenario that we are targeting? Is it like a moving target, or do we work with scenarios? So what does the methodology say in the ISO standard? And what is your opinion based on what the governments are planning for? Are we planning for a scenario that we end up at 1.5 degrees and that it's going to improve soon? Or do we really have like a worst case scenario that we need to embed in our standards, that we need to prepare for? I mean, some companies do that. The question is that a methodology that we have embedded in our standards, and how would we deal with that also in communication with the policymakers? Any ideas, Martin?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So there are some different drivers that are forcing this issue. So one, of course, is just companies understanding that they have a risk, and that risk could be because of their location. So it could be a risk in their supply chain. And scenario assessment and evaluation allows you to start to understand how those risks might play out in practice with different, if you like, tolerances. I think where it becomes really interesting now is the finance system is asking for climate-related risks to be disclosed to investors and shareholders, and therefore you need as a company a methodology. Now, different organizations might want you to stress test your risks based on different scenarios. So it could be that you want a flood risk of a 1 in 100 year, or 1 in 250 year, or 1 in 500 year. So it wouldn't necessarily be based on a temperature. It might be based on a physical risk that you can understand as a business. It might be a temperature, because that might be, for an occupational safety and health, and the tragic case that you said about somebody dying. Well, we need to understand what that temperature might mean. In water, it might be how long is a prolonged drought. So we need, scenarios need to be relevant to the context of the organisation and the risks that it faces. All of that has to be, in my view, underpinned by science. And it's really important that we bring science to bear on what is happening in terms of extreme weather events, and the scenarios therefore are rooted in something that has kind of credibility behind it, and then I think we can start to apply these standards in that wider context.
But I understand you're right. The methodology takes that into consideration. Right. You wanted to come in, Ricardo? All right. All right. There we go. Please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Carol Franco from Dominican Republic. I am advisor of nature-based solutions for the Ministry of Environment of Dominican Republic. That's a very interesting question. I would say, and I will put an example, just a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we had an extreme weather event, and we received around 435 millimeters of rain in 6 hours, or less than 6 hours. There was massive flooding, there was massive damage to infrastructure. This was in the city, in Santo Domingo. half or a part of a tunnel fell down on top of cars because of all the amount of water that was draining. And this is going to continue to happen more and more. And again, one of the priorities of the Dominican Republic is adaptation, of course, as a small island development state. So answering that question that you said, there were deaths, drownings. There are videos that look like it's a movie, basically, like a horror movie, on how it was, cars were basically flooded away and everything. So I would say we do need to prepare, and I think organizations, especially energy companies, needs to also prepare, because those are the ones that suffer the most. We are also on the hits of hurricanes. I mean, it's like one after the other after the other. As we know, one of the impacts of climate change is the increase in intensity and numbers of our hurricanes. So we do need to prepare. Electricity is one of them. How we can have separate nodes. How do we make sure that we have electricity even though we have a hurricane, we have flooding? But how do we, I mean, for us, adaptation plans are key. And how do we can move forward that? But one of those questions is actually mine. And it's, we need finance, we need capacity building, we need technology transfer. And these are the means of implementation, so we can get to a point that we can really have the ways that we can adapt to climate change. And I think that's the heart. I'm also a negotiator here for agriculture, and that's the heart of everything. How do we make sure we have that? And it's not just finance, of course not, but it's capacity building, and we're working on it. But it's also, how do we move forward? It's education. It's also technology. So how do we deploy that technology? But how do we have the finance and the capacity building to implement that technology? So we need to start, I know we're working on it, but we need to move forward with that. Because again, extreme weather events are going to continue to happen. They're going to continue to happen more and more. We have seen it. And even though we're trying to be prepared, we are definitely not prepared. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to highlight on one of the points that Martin have mentioned when it comes into climate reporting, because that's definitely an access point for investors, and that's something that we work on closely with cities at ICLEI as part of our ICLEI CDP track, where cities already now, I would say not only cities but also businesses, when it comes into climate mitigation reporting, climate adaptation is yet new to them, so it's something that we also are working on very closely. But the reason why that is happening, because the measurement of climate adaptation core benefits is actually something that again needs to be worked out on the long term, and what would be, let's say, the investments that needs to be put into that. But also when we speak about financiers and having access to finance, it's very important to understand as well that financiers do not understand the needs of the city. So there is a gap in communication between both of them. And that's also something that we just started working on a project that's called Climate Fit, funded by the European Commission, where we are actually trying to bridge that gap. So communicating with financiers, understand what their needs are from the city, what do you expect from the city to be prepared and have a bankable project for them to invest into, in particular in climate adaptation, but then also bring the cities through capacity building into climate reporting and be able to put these plans into financing strategies.
Julia?
So again, Julia from Jamaica. But so I've been attending a lot of meetings in this COP, and the common theme is financing. And so I'm asking now, in terms of the business case for an investor, he wants money, return on his investment. We're talking about social issues and humanitarian issues. So how does standards address those measurements so that the business investor can see in integrity on his return? Now, he invests his money. He really wants ROI, but he will also be amenable to social and humanitarian KPIs, because we are in the climate change and he has to respond. So I'm just saying, from the standards point of view, is how can we do that? One, have measurable indicators for social impact, and two, well, the other one was in the standard 14,064 and others. are we suggesting that we have scenarios in the standards? Because it seems to be a kind of, how many scenarios do we have and how do we manage that?
Yeah, I think finance is absolutely critical, and I think there are a couple of examples where we're starting to see businesses putting finance into their supply chain to manage some of this risk. And the lady from who was talking about agriculture. So an example that I've seen in the UK, but now has been taken from the UK to a kind of a global company, is they pay a sustainability premium to farms which enhance the quality of their land in terms of natural capital in order to become more resilient. And they do that because they think that they have priced the risk, and they think that by being more resilient, they have a more secure supply chain. Where that got really interesting was at COP27 last year, when Nescafe, global brand, has committed 1 billion Swiss francs, so in my kind of line, about 1 billion, into supporting the finance for regenerative agriculture for coffee bean growers. And obviously, you know, Nescafe without coffee beans isn't a brand. It isn't a business. And they have lots and lots of very small farmers. And when you move towards regenerative agriculture, you have a reduction in yield. And what Nestle has said is, if we do not finance the transition of these farmers, they won't be supplying us at all. So we are now starting to see innovative ways in which finance is able to flow in that reduction in risk. I think when it comes to other aspects of finance, companies value their assets. And therefore, understanding the risk to their assets and what it will cost to protect an asset then becomes a basis on which they can generate, you know, investment, because they have assets they can. So in the corporate world, I think it's starting to kind of speak that language around either asset management, supply chain risk. Where it gets really, really difficult, of course, is when you have to work in partnership, because no one business on its own can be fully resilient. And in certain places, you're going to have to work collaboratively. And working in partnership and collaboration, it sounds really easy because it's not technical, but actually it's about people. And kind of working with people can be really difficult over big areas to manage those risks.
Yeah, thank you. I just had an idea because you were speaking a lot about funding. And I was remembering the first day of this COP. There was this big success our politicians published. It was this loss and damage fund, which is now almost $1 billion of dollars in it. And today in the taxi, it was funny. I had the chance to meet a woman, the director of the environment of the Fiji Islands. So these are many little islands in the middle of nowhere in the ocean. And we were speaking about exactly that, like they are suffering from climate change a lot. And at the same time, they are asking themselves, how do we get money from this international fund? Because we are small and there are maybe countries that raise their voice louder. And my thought was maybe through standards. So could that be an idea to link that loss and damage fund, or this fund that should protect countries from climate change, make them able to adapt to our ISO standards, so that we make sure there is a measurement and that there is a fair distribution of the funds.
I think the key word is to offer a methodology how to evaluate what's the damage that has been created and who has kind of the most right to receive combined compensation. It's the same that companies do as an evaluation, where to invest, what is resilient in different climate scenarios, or what kind is my footprint that I leave to the world so that I am competitive in 20 years when this becomes more and more important. And that's the market that is evaluating this. And that's why we as ISO have sought a cooperation with the IFRS Foundation, so that the financial and especially the sustainability related reporting requirements that they use to evaluate companies are actually based on methodologies from international standards, that they are not reinventing the wheel, that we are basically contributing our standards catalog, our methodologies embedded in management system standards that are then used as an implementation guideline for these reporting criteria. And then of course that methodology can be utilized to finance companies, to compensate countries, to kind of investments in sustainable cities. I think that would be a good starting point where we can actually increase the visibility, the value of our standards, and basically provide that knowledge. But I would really like to move on to the next question. You will be the next in line, but I think the next question that we have is actually to evaluate. Yes? So maybe we can just have that in mind when answering the next question, because we have the standards. We basically presented what is already available. The question is, are you utilizing those standards? On a scale from 1 to 5, is it something that is known and used? And then of course it's obvious that the discussion is, what can we do to kind of boost the knowledge about these methodologies and the use of these methodologies, because that's our target. But now I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the discussion, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Marco Wilkens from the University of Augsburg, and I represent our Center for Climate Resilience. So in Augsburg at the university, we founded the Center for Climate Resilience. And if you have to ask me how far is science in thinking about climate adaptation, I would say, okay, there are some science on climate mitigation by now, and on climate mitigation we have more and more science, but concerning climate adaptation, there's really just a few people thinking about that, researchers and so on and so on, and therefore that is one reason we founded the Center for Climate Resilience. So I'm a professor of finance and banking, and I would like to address one question with regard to the scenario. So you asked, so what is the scenario we look at? Specifically, if we want to attract money, that means if you want to attract foreign investments, and my answer would be it can't be one single scenario, because a foreign investor or the business people itself or the management would have to look at any scenario possible. So if you want to judge an investment, you have to know what could happen. And one scenario is just one case. And maybe this case is very unlikely. And therefore, and maybe this is an idea for the standard setup as well, maybe you should more look at, is the company able to fit different scenarios? So if there is a chance to transform the company. And I think that is much more important than being on a 1.5 or 2.5, whatever track. If you are on that track and if you can't change, you are very, very risky. But if you are able, if you are flexible as a company, you are less risky. And therefore my statement would be not looking at just one scenario, but looking at different scenarios. At least if you want to take the perspective of someone who wants to pay money or wants to set up a business or wants to credit a business. If you come from the regulator's perspective, then one scenario makes sense, even that 1.5 scenario, because you want to push the economy to be in line with 1.5. So, but this is a different aim, and therefore, as a standard setter, you have to ask, what is the main aim? Do you want to have the regulatory authorities or the politicians, or do you want to help the business? And we want to help the business, please go for many scenarios. That's very important. Thanks.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot for the input. And I think we discussed before that the scenario is actually not, is it 1.5 or 1.6? Is it, do I calculate with the summer with a week of 45 degrees? Do I calculate with a tremendous flood that I need to cope with? So that's basically the resulting effect of a changing climate. Very good. Ricardo, I think you wanted to come in next.
My comment is more as the policymaker. I think it's needed to scientific engagement. It is necessary more information about the funding, international funding for the policymakers, about the range of the scenarios after the adaptations of the climate, the changing climate. It's very important for example, in Brazilian, the policymakers, don't know this problem. It's only information about the newspapers only. In the situation, the flood of Dubai, the problem of the Brazil, the deforestation of the Amazon, the forest Amazon. It's not important for us. It's important information, the high quality information about the scenarios, these perspective scenarios.
So if I understand you right, I mean, you're responding to disasters that are happening rather than using a known methodology to calculate and to prepare ahead. Is that right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we are trying to tell that we need to open a dialogue with policymakers. We need to show them that we have the standards, what the standards can do for the climate adaptation. And in Brazil, we are struggling with this. ABNT has opened a lot of doors in the environmental ministry, in the Congress. We are trying to take the standards to the policymakers. So they need to understand what we have to offer to them. It's something like this.
But if we try to ask ourselves, what can we do better? So what do you need in terms of promotion material that you are successful in explaining to your policymakers what is available? Do you need a few Martins that you can take with you?
I'm sorry. I think it's necessary to promote the scenarios, the information, the high quality about scenarios, because this is, for me, ABNT, more easy to provide these policymakers and the stakeholders about the information about the scenario, the range of the adaptation of the climate change. It's very important for us. And this is the mission, in my opinion, of the ISO in this moment.
Of course, ISO is already doing this. For example, in the General Assembly, we saw the toolkit that ISO provided regarding the policymakers. Yes, so I think it's good to have more things like this, more toolkits, more information, more more simple information, I guess, because they are don't experts on this subject. So we need to provide more simple information, I guess. Yes.
So Martin, do good things and talk about it. And talk about it in a language that policymakers do understand. So a simple toolkit that can actually present this methodology in an easy to understand way, and easy to kind of digest, and exactly, so that we're educating the policymakers on what is available. But if we move a little bit from the policymakers and educating policymakers to, having a useful toolkit for companies. So is that something that is valuable from a company point of view?
I actually want to just talk about the recent ISSB, standard that has been rather successful in 2 years and bring a lot of attention, but also real changes right now. And they just had this agreement with ISO to do something together. And if I think of their standard, they have net zero. They can on emissions, they work with GHG protocol. They work with on net zero standard. On the adaptation transition plan, they could work with you on this. They also have the coastal internal control with the financial sector. They're integrating a lot of things together. It's a rather complicated stuff, but they still manage to communicate with a lot of stakeholders, in 2 years, getting a lot of feedback in terms of making it easy to use easy to understand, and they took a simple strategy that this is for investors. They hope that this will affect how they allocate capital and try to convince you that this will happen. And if you do that, you are ahead of the others. And in the meantime, they try to improve the interoperability of their standard with many of the others, rather than creating more standards, more things to do, and reducing. Saying by doing this one, you don't have to do some of the others. Overall, I know ISO standards. There are many of them. To be honest, that will be a challenge because I was talking with another company's CSO who also complained about even the ISSB board doesn't have anyone with a preparer experience. They have a lot of very experienced professionals, but from a preparer perspective, it's a lot of work. And if that becomes a hurdle, that really hurts the effectiveness of a good standard with a lot of science behind it. So I think there's something there to learn, and you are working with them. And also in terms of scenarios before, I guess we do get feedback from rating agencies about this company and that company are not choosing the right scenario for them. It has to be material. UK has its own climate stress, and different from China because we're a different part of the world and different business, different community, and so scenarios are useful. It has to be close enough, reasonable enough. So in that way, to not make it too rigid, actually is necessary for adaptation, as naturally for the nature of the problem.
Does that resonate with you, Martin? I think it's a valid point that the complexity of our standards catalog is quite immense because we're coming from the technical detail. As long as we stick to one sector, it's understandable. But if we're trying to solve systemic problems with a standards catalog where we can say we offer 20,000 standards that are addressing climate, but where to start? And I think the ISSB approach, coming top down, having a simple message, simple parameters that are offered to the financial markets to investigate and evaluate finally where to invest, what is a safe investment. But as soon as we drill it down, of course, that is the linkage to the ISO standards. They can refer to the details described in ISO standards. But if you want to approach policymakers or have a simple offering for small and medium-sized enterprises that cannot cope with thousands of standards, we need to be able to simplify, which is like a cultural change in our committees. So make it like an 80-20 rule. So what is good enough to have a first understanding? Why is it so important? And then drill down and provide the details that we have in a standard system. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense. And I think, complexity, the challenges that we face are complex. And the solutions are also fairly complex as well. And if you don't understand the system, then you can be lulled into a false sense of security that you are actually kind of doing well when you're not. And I think the disclosure standards are really important, but what they don't do is tell you how to improve. And what ISO standards are there to do is to say, here is a way in which you can manage and demonstrate continual improvement. And of course, that should come through in the disclosures overall, but then it does require an element of technical delivery in an organization in order to do this. And ultimately, it comes down to the capability and skills of the people who are leading this work. Because if you don't have the skills and capacity and capability to do this, it doesn't matter what the disclosure standards say, it doesn't matter what you write in a standard. Actually, you need somebody who's able to apply that in an organizational setting and drive change. So that's, to my mind, is the other bit that we don't do enough about, is the capacity building to make sure that our standards are actually delivering what they do. I think the other facts, or the other aspects I would say is that not all of these risks will manifest themselves at a global company level as being something that concerns an investor. Unfortunately, one person dying on an industrial site doesn't upset an investor generally, because it's, this happens in certain situations. So I think we also have to understand that there are other risks or the way in which risks get crystallized don't always just have a single financial global kind of business impact, that there are others got to kind of work that through as well.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Before we conclude, I mean, are there any final comments and questions you might want to raise? Please.
Apologies, I was slightly late to the conversation, so you might have covered this off in the introduction. I'm Alison Heppenstall, Climate Action for Associations. Sorry, Ali Heppenstall, Climate Action for Associations. To what extent do you, in every single standard that you have, you refer to the ISO Net Zero guidelines? Because the ISO Net Zero guidelines have specific points around policy and leadership and implementation with some really clear steps. And they're very relatively simple to digest and really useful for every business, particularly small businesses, in relation to this question. So I'm wondering if you don't do it already, a relatively easy way might be to reference and almost like request the implementation of the ISO Net Zero guidelines in every single standard that you have. You may do it already, and I don't know. Yeah.
And the answer is always, we do it, but not across the board. And that's why it's so important to convey that message. That is a simple thing, that the methodologies, that the guidelines that are already available, let's make use of them. Any other thoughts you want to share before we close? Did you find the input useful that we gathered? I think also the latest kind of discussion that we had regarding the top-down approach to simplify things, to attract people to the topic of standardization, but then don't lose out on the details, because it's complex issues. We need experts, we need capacity building, but it's also important to simplify as a means of communication in order to make policymakers understand, to attract people to standardization, to get approval from the decision-making level. And I think then we need the experts, because in the end it's about the technical details, the deep understanding what really helps and works. Not only greenwashing because it looks good, we need to do the right things. And I think ISO can offer a large community of these experts, but sometimes it's hard to find the right committee, hard to communicate to this technical community, and that's why the hint, I mean, to have partners like ISSB basically pointing on ISO standards that will attract people from the financial market, from the high-level priority setting, that will end up in being experts in the technical committees, or at least embracing the details that they find in ISO standards. So one final remark, please.
I just want to add one thing. When I in IC7, all of the experts, including the chair, raised one question that can the climate change standard, ISO standard, be free to all of the public, because there one example that's the GHG protocol, who is for free to all the audience and the users. It's used widely, maybe better than ISO standards. So I don't know. It's possible. It's for free, because it's just like you said, Chair. We have to gathering around more listening, more listening, and more users for standards, especially for adaptation standards. There's less people to know than the mitigation standards. So I think it's a raised question. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for the very valuable question. I think that goes into the scenario of how much are people aware about our standards? Are they readable and understandable? You want a short question? A question is always good.
So a very short one. Do you talk about, if you talk about thinking about setting up a standard for adaptation, do you talk about capturing physical risks only? So that is what my impression is, that you are talking about physical risk, or do you talk also about transition risk? Because I think for the southern part of the world, probably the physical risks are more important, whereas the transition risks might be more important, or is more important than, at least for some companies, than the physical risk. So is it transition risk or physical risk you're looking at, or you want to look at?
That was some of my questions was when I was looking at TCFD, documents, and they have transition plan. They sometimes have adaptation plan. They have adaptation and transition plan. I mean, it sounds to me one way is to adaptation plans for physical risk only and transition plan for transition risk. But of course, they have an overall transition plan for all the risks. So these are confusing. Yeah.
So are we addressing both type of risks?
Well, ISO standards do, because we have standards which support, and the net zero guidelines are a great example of, helping an organization to go on that transition journey to a net zero future. The climate adaptation ones are around reducing risks from physical risk, either one-off events, which could be flooding, risk of drought, or the financial impacts associated with ongoing climate impacts. And a good example is we see this now in ports and harbours, which are over time they're silting up more quickly, and therefore you have a financial cost because you have to dredge more regularly. So high levels of high intensity rainfall in catchments brings more sediment into harbours. They have to be, so that has a kind of an ongoing impact which you have to operationalise the cost of those. And harbour walls are being battered by bigger storms, and therefore, so these are all areas which, in terms of kind of climate adaptation and risk management, and therefore the investment that is needed to fund kind of the mitigation action, or the actions to mitigate those risks are clearly there. So I think all of that is within the standards which we have. The question is, are we teaching people how to use them in the most effective way? And I think that's a big question mark.
We didn't expect to be able to provide answers to everything. The value is in the question. I think it's a lot of food for thought. I took a lot of homework to discuss as kind of the one being responsible for policy and governance. But I think also you got good input from a technical point of view, what we should take into consideration for our valuable technical work. But then, of course, how to communicate the results, how to communicate it in simple terms that we can bring these results to policy people as well as to the companies, that they are really easy to grasp, easy to understand, easy to find, maybe not too costly, and in the end, usable overall. So thanks a lot for the good discussion. Thanks a lot for all your contribution, and have a successful COP.